I'm Ari Gross. I'm the creator of Wardens, and you're listening to True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book and graphic novel creators and supporters. I'm John Swinimer. On this episode, I chat with Ari Gross about his new Kickstarter project, Wardens. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel. Ari Gross is based in Toronto, Ontario, and when he's not being an historic scientific instrument collection curator or a worm viewer designer for the Ontario Science Centre, he's writing comic books. His past efforts have included Quantum Kirby, Don't Go Below, The Longest Case, and others. His latest comic book series with artist Robert Jenex is entitled Wardens. Wardens is set in 1926 in Toronto's multicultural immigrant neighborhood, The Ward. It follows Jewish seamstress and back alley brawler Rachel Tussman, who is plunged into a world of Kabbalistic magic when a fire destroys their place of work and gives rise to the Shmata, a spiteful union of possessed clothes out for bloody revenge. Wardens is described as a celebration of Toronto's rich cultural tapestry, an exploration of lost but not forgotten neighborhood focusing on its Jewish, Chinese, and Black communities. It's got action, drama, laughs, enough Yiddish to make your booby plots. So without further ado, here's my chat with Ari Gross about his new Kickstarter project, Wardens. So Ari Gross, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Yeah, thanks. Great chatting with you too.
I appreciate your time. Before we get started with all the questions, I want to ask you if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
So the first comic that I read was called The Untold Legend of the Batman. This was a 3-issue kind of small little miniseries. I've got it in my hand right now, written by Len Wein and drawn by Jim Aparo. I never quite figured out how to say that. It was these 3 little issues. They were like smaller. I think they were like done for kids, and it came with a tape. And I remember sitting in my bedroom, and the tape would like read the story to you. It was a whole, like, it was like a new thing they were trying out. It was like they thought this was going to, like, I guess, take over comics, and it didn't. But it was really cool. Like, I remember reading this as a kid and like flipping the pages when like the bing, you heard the tape. Yeah. And I didn't realize till years later, I was like, oh, this is like they got like a serious comic writer and like a serious comic artist to do it. It wasn't like sort of, I don't know, like a random, oh, let's just get a couple of chumps. It was like, no, they got like good people to tell a good story. And it holds up. I actually read it last year and I was like, are you kidding? Anyway, it was a real blast from the past that these 3 small ones, The Untold Legend of the Batman, if anyone has it.
Yeah, that's a classic. Len Wein, definitely, and Jim Aparo, great Batman writers for sure. Yeah. And great stuff growing up. But I'm wondering, who or what inspires you to create today?
There's a lot of people that inspire me. I tend to read a lot of, I do read like Big 2 stuff, but I've been reading a lot more Image stuff, I guess, these days. A lot of Tynan, a lot of, not as much Scott Snyder as I used to, although I'm in his comic class, or at least I've been in there for the past 3 years. So, him talking about all the stuff has made me maybe dive into it. Honestly, the things that make me want to create comics these days aren't so much what other people are doing. It's more just kind of telling the stories that I want to tell. It's been a lot of sort of, that feeling, maybe you don't, maybe you do, where you have a story and there's no other story like it. And you're just like, okay, well, if I don't tell this, no one's going to tell this because I haven't seen this anywhere. That's what I want to do. And I really want to tell stories that are very local. I've lived in Toronto since, 2007, I think. Yeah, so 16 years. I grew up in Montreal. I went to school a few different places in the Maritimes, lived in Vancouver for a little bit. So I kind of want to tell like Canadian stories, but Canadian stories in a way that's not your sort of traditional kind of, I don't know, lit, people being sad in the prairies because it's cold or whatever. I want to do something different and tell stories that sort of reflect the place I live in and the people I see every day and the sort of, the communities that actually exist rather than, people can tell stories about, all different stories about Canadian stuff elsewhere, but I don't know. I feel like I've got a different sort of a different agenda. Certainly, I mean, my comic publishing line, whatever you call the publisher, it's called College Street Comics. I live near College Street, a major street in Toronto, and I sort of associate very strongly with place. So yeah, a lot of my comics have to do with place, and we'll get to that as we talk about it.
Sure. Now that's what they always say is like write what you know. Like if you've got a personal story that will come out in the narrative more so than you trying to write another Batman or Spider-Man story because you can't relate, right? So that's what they. But let's talk about your latest project. It's called Wardens. How would you describe it?
So Wardens is a supernatural action, I guess, historical fiction. A little funny, but not like a straight comedy, a little dramatic, but not a straight drama. It takes place in 1926 in an old area of Toronto called the Ward. It's called St. John's Ward. Most people there just called it the Ward. It was one of the first immigrant neighborhoods in Toronto, at least one of the first neighborhoods that was predominantly non-Anglo-Saxon. From the late 19th century on until about the mid-1950s, it was largely populated by Jews, Eastern European, Ashkenazi Jews, Chinese people, Italians, Black people who had actually, many of their families had been living in the ward since the mid-19th century. A lot of them were descendants from escaped slaves from the Underground Railroad. And there was a wealthy Black family. I forget the guy's name now. It's all in the research. I got so many notes on this, who actually bought a bunch of houses around and made a small community there for a lot of people. So it's this interesting community that sort of existed in the early 20th century, which doesn't exist anymore. I mean, the area that we're talking about, if anybody knows Toronto, it's from University to Yonge, Queen to College. That is downtown Toronto. That's like RBC, like Bay Street, like big banks, massive city hall stuff. And at this time, 100 years ago, it was nothing like that. It was the slums. It was the poor area of Toronto that the rest of Toronto wanted to get rid of and clear out because they didn't know what to do with all the poor immigrants living there. Basically, it was not looked on very favorably. So I wanted to write a story that is situated in this kind of unique neighborhood. This, at an interesting sort of point of time in the 20s when things are changing, is sort of like the cusp of modernity. There's these, people are having struggles between, trying to be modern and holding on to their values and trying to integrate with a larger city that doesn't necessarily want them to integrate with them, or having to integrate even with their neighbors who are totally different. I mean, the main Jewish area is on Center Avenue, which is 2 blocks over from the main Chinese area, which is on Elizabeth Street. And so a lot of my stories about people living side by side, trying to, it starts off kind of in their own bubbles, but then you sort of get over that and work together to overcome these sort of supernatural threats that I'm throwing at them. So it's got this whole sort of supernatural Jewish mystical angle. At the end of the issue, it gives rise, there's a fire that gives rise to a bunch of possessed clothes called the Shmata. So it just wants to get revenge on basically everybody. And so it's kind of like a bit of a superhero sort of setup where there's the villain in play and then the people have to sort of react to that. But they don't just want to preserve the status quo. They want to figure out how to live their lives in this neighborhood, in this area that doesn't necessarily in this city that's not super friendly to them necessarily, but still dealing, with all their local issues, all their sort of, the political stuff. There's lots of labor issues, lots of stuff about, race and gender and people trying to, navigate the complexities of their lives while also just being kind of a fun story. I don't want to get bogged down in the sadness of the time. It would be very easy to tell a story about, poor immigrants living in a rundown neighborhood and make it sad. But that is 100% the opposite of what I want to do. I want something that's sort of fun, upbeat. They're frustrated and they're angry, but they're not crying. They're looking to do something about it. Yeah, so that's what Wardens is about. It's an action comic. Every issue's got some action in it. Every issue's got a bunch of Yiddish. I don't speak fluent Yiddish. Most people my age don't. Most people who speak. So Yiddish, for those of you who don't know, is sort of the ancestral language of the Eastern European Jews. My grandparents all spoke Yiddish fluently. My parents, speak a little bit because their parents spoke it. But I'm trying to bring it back a bit. So if anyone reads Wardens, they'll learn how to swear in Yiddish. That's my promise to you all. Because Yiddish is the funnest language to swear in. And I'm just trying to sort of have a bit of fun with it, and trying to have sort of a high energy, upbeat sort of story that, is situated in a very culturally specific area at a very particular time, but, touches on enough of the generalities and the struggles, in the way that you can relate to their struggles so that it's not, the generality from specificity. You know what I mean?
Right. Right. Well, I get the impression from reading your bio that you're more a science-based person rather than a historian. So, with that in mind, I'm wondering what research did you do to create these books?
I am actually both. I have a PhD in the history and philosophy of science, if you can believe it. So I'm kind of like I'm actually like technically a trained historian and a trained philosopher, in addition to being like a guy who did a bunch of years studying physics. So there's a lot of history that went into this. First and foremost, there's a book called The Ward: The Life and Loss of Toronto's First Immigrant Neighborhood. It's was by Coach House Books. So it's a series of short essays. It's an anthology about people who did research into it. A bunch of historians who like wanted to tell different stories about the ward, and so I sort of use that as a jumping off point. There's a few other books that I used as well, but it's tough doing this because my instinct as like a historian is to be like, oh, well, I need all the facts. I need to spend all the time doing all the research. But as a person who's like a writer, you got to be like, you can't just tell all the history. That's not an interesting story. It's got to be a character driven story. I want Wardens to be like characters first. The setting informs the characters and all that, but it's not just me, sort of a dry retelling of things that happened. It's a fun sort of historical fiction romp. And there's a lot of stuff left on the cutting floor in terms of anecdotes and stuff like that. A lot of things that were like, oh, that's such a cool thing to tell. That's a really interesting, like, historical factoid. No one knows about this. But, you got to, maybe it'll be in a future issue. Like, it's not going to be a number one. Yeah, stick it in your back pocket. Maybe it'll come up. Maybe it won't. Maybe it's just something you talk about when you talk about the book. Who knows? Like, so there's a lot going on. There's a lot of research, but I've been trying to limit myself to the amount of research before you start writing, because you don't want to just be beholden to someone else's story. You want to have your own story and then, find the research that helps inform or support it and help steer it a little bit.
Exactly. You mentioned that you're the writer on the book. I'm wondering who else helped you with the illustration and other parts.
Right. So this book is primarily a two-hander. It's me. I'm the writer. I'm also the letterer because I am insane about editing dialogue up until the last second. And I've never lettered anything before. So it's been really fun learning how to do that. And then there's the artist, who is Rob Jennings. He's a guy out of Nova Scotia. He's out of Cape Breton, New Waterford, I think he's in, which is like pretty close to Sydney. It's basically like the end of Nova Scotia. He's the artist, like, for everything. He's, pencils, inks, colors, the whole kit and caboodle, which has been a lot of work on his part. I mean, every page you see, it's just all him drawing it, which made the book take longer because it's a 44-page book. And all these issues are going to be 44 pages. That's just sort of how I structured it. So yeah, Rob's great. He worked on a book, I think it's had 4 issues so far, called Morgan's Organs, which is kind of like pitched as like an adult-oriented Inside Out, but with organs, like your brain, your kidney, Guy's dick, like the whole, like all the organs competing inside a thing, which has been pretty fun. Also another Canadian, Daniel Brody wrote it. I put out a call for artists on, I don't know, 5 or 6 different platforms, like everything I can think of, like ArtStation, DeviantArt, Facebook, Twitter, like, Insta, whatever. And tons of people got back to me, but he was the only one that I actually thought was right for the project. It was so crazy. I expected there to be like a bunch of people who were like, oh, this person's good, but this person's good, but this person, like, no, there was only like one person who seemed right, which was just kind of like something I realized afterwards. Like, finding a partner to do these projects is so hard. You have to find the person who he got my vision right away. Like his initial sketches of the characters, I was like, okay, clearly, we're just 100% on the same page here. So, and he's been great to work with, a great guy. And
that's cool.
I haven't met him in person yet. Hopefully I'll get to meet him. I'm thinking I'm heading out to Cape Breton this summer. So maybe I'll
never know.
Swing by. Yeah, the end of Cape Breton if I can. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about initial illustrations, but can you talk about the collaboration process? Was it something you had written the entire script and then said, okay, Robert, away you go? Or how did it work out for you?
I started writing comics in May 2020, so fairly early on to the pandemic. I've had an idea for Wardens for some time, and then I was like, it just sort of came a point where I'm like, well, I got to write this or not, sort of get off the pot on this thing. I've never written a comic before at this point. And I was like, let's just do it. So I took the year and I wrote the whole story for like the first arc, the first main thing, which is 6 issues, each 44 pages, like 264 pages of script. And then I was like going to people, I was like, hey, I wrote a comic, like the script, like, how do I get it made? Everyone's like, so what comics have you made? And I was like, I haven't made any yet. I want to make this one. Everyone's like, well, why don't you make like a 4-page comic first? Like, just see how the process works, understand how to do it. And of course, they're right. So I ended up doing a bunch of shorts, a few anthologies, found a good group of people. I joined a Scott Snyder's comic writing class, and I was involved in the Tales from the Cloakroom anthology, which have a 6-page short in there. That was sort of one of my first, forays into like just doing this thing, getting into Kickstarter, understanding how all that works. And then last year I did a single issue Kickstarter, a sci-fi comic called Awakening, which is basically a love letter to Star Trek. A love letter slash like, Twilight Zone-y sort of thing, which I had a lot of fun with. And I did that because I was like, before I launch my big series, I want to just see how this works. I want to run a Kickstarter campaign by myself, do a one-shot, understand how it is, understand like what it means to fulfill, like actually physically ship things out to people. And after all that, I was like, okay, now it's time to like start going into the big project. So I have the roughs ready. I've been working with editor Aubrey Lynn Jepson, who's great. I met her through the Scott Snyder class, and she's edits everything I do and lots of things other people do, and deserves all the praise in the world. Yeah, and a lot of that, the things that you learn from doing comics at a small level, like 4 pages, 6 pages, whatever, is you just learn how to collaborate. Like, it's not like you like have a script and then the artist does exactly what's in your mind and it's perfect. There's like, there's a give and take, right? You got to let them bring their strengths to the book. You got to let them know when, it's a cool idea, but it's not the idea we're going for here. And you have to, there's a lot of, like understanding how to just work with another person who's just, a different person that has their own ideas, and letting them bring their ideas to the table as much as you bring your own. And Rob's been great for that. I have to say, he's like one of the easiest collaborators. For some other of the short comics I had, like, I was like, when someone sends me something like that, my pages are in, I was filled with anxiety because I was like, I know I'm just going to have to like make a bunch of comments on these and it's not going to be what I want. Rob, never like that. Whenever I get pages from this guy, I'm just like, these are great. Like maybe 1 or 2 small things, but like he knows what's up.
That's cool.
So,
that's good. That's good. Now,
really
this is a Kickstarter project. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the rewards that you're offering with this.
So first reward is the comic itself, digital version. As there's sort of the physical and digital, as it's pretty standard for Kickstarter projects. The comic is a 44-page comic. Again, it's fatter than usual. Basically, it's like a double book. It's going to have 4 pages of back matter, an essay, some character sketches, and a piece of sheet music that I wrote. In the comic, there's like a novelty, sort of like 1920s like novelty song and dance thing. And I wrote lyrics for that. And then I was like, well, if I wrote lyrics for that, I got to write the song for it. So I just wrote like a sheet, like a 1-page lead sheet, just with chords and the melody, so people can play along. If I do super well in the comic and like, it's, way supported more than I expect, I'll probably take some time and as a stretch goal, it's not officially announced or anything, but I'll probably try to like record the song. So that should be fun. But so there's the comic itself. The next tier of rewards is the comic plus a couple of postcards. These are panels from the book, but in the back, it's like a postcard. You could actually send it. The next tier up is an art print. It's called a Mario 3 inspired art print. So I don't know if you remember the cover of Mario 3 where he's like flying with his little Tanuki suit on. Yeah, there's a whole spread apparently that's from where there's a whole bunch of like Bowser's in the background and all the Koopa kids are coming in from a castle. And my artist is like completely obsessed with like video games from like the 80s and 90s, which is great because I am too. So like, again, same page, And so he pitched this as a variant cover. And I was like, that is so good. Cool idea. But like, don't make it a variant cover. Let's keep that in our back pocket as like an 8x10 art print that we can include. People can, either stick on their walls or whatever they want to do with it. It came out really well. I'm just looking at it right now. I'm really happy about it.
Nice. That's great.
2 more rewards I'll just mention. The next one up from that is original 1920s inspired character designs. So my artist is doing for us all sort of me, the editor, and him pictures as if we're sort of, from like the 20s. So it's original art basically for anyone who's interested. And the biggest reward is the all that plus a draw into issue number 2, which if you want him to design a character based off you, that sort of for the previous reward, that can actually be in issue number 2. I've got perfect place in mind for lots of people. So if anybody wants to be in a comic and wants to have a particular 1920 style avatar of themselves, that's the way to go.
Oh, lots of good stuff there, that's for sure. Now, I know, but we've been talking about Wardens for this discussion, but do you have any other up-and-coming projects that you can talk about?
I do. My goal is to have 2 ongoing comic series. There's more stuff I want to write, which I'll talk about in a much later date, but Wardens and Upkeep. Upkeep is a modern horror / family drama that takes place in Toronto and in the West End. It's a couple with a young kid that are looking for a house and can't afford a house because no one can afford a house, because it's, the modern horror story, the real life horror story is the fact that over the past like 20 years, I think 20 or 30, I forget exactly, like wages have gone up 15%. The housing prices have gone up like 400%.
Mm-hmm.
So they're looking to get in the market and they can't. And so they end up responding to this sort of weird ad, and that leads them to this house that's this incredible, gorgeous manor, kind of this magical sort of place tucked away. It's always across Garrison Creek, which is this old creek that no longer exists in Toronto. It got turned into a sewer, runs throughout the West End. There's a series of parks now over in schools. And so this house can give them anything they want, anything that exists in the real world. It's, food, entertainment, access, information, whatever. The only thing the house wants is occasional upkeep. So to find the evilest person and send them off to the basement of the house where who knows what happens and they're never heard from again. It's a classic sort of like, what would you do for your dream?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like inspired by like Little Shop of Horrors, that kind of like, something promises you the world and you want to take it, but there's a cost to it, and the cost is, you're going to have to become someone who you didn't expect to become.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's something to look forward to. That's for sure.
Yeah. And so this series, it starts off like year 1. And I think one of the beautiful things about the series is every issue is going to be 1 year in the future. So we're going to see the family grow from like just, the couple with their young kid who's like 1-year-old to having another kid to other characters who end up moving into the house as well with them. And, like, what does it mean to grow up in this weird sort of place of like intense, almost like secret privilege with this darkness behind it as well. So I really want this to be like a decades-long story to explore, how the family deals with all this. I've got it all planned out. I'm really excited about it. It's the first time doing like a longer horror story. I've done a couple of smaller horror stories as well. So I'm really excited. I think it's going to be great.
Sure, absolutely. Now, because you've had a lot of experience in making comic books, I want to ask you if you can provide just one piece of advice for someone who might be thinking about making their own comic book.
Like I think I said before, the best piece of advice that was given to me that I can pass on is start small. Do a 1-pager. If you don't want to do 1-pager, do a 2-pager, do a 4-pager. If you can't make a 4-page comic, you can't make a 40-page comic. You need to just understand how the process works, and you need to understand how to meet people to collaborate with. That's also very difficult. There's lots of places where you can put yourself out on like either Facebook or Twitter and say, hey, I'm looking for an artist, blah, blah, blah. And lots of people will say yes or no. This is if you're looking to work with someone. If you're doing it by yourself, of course, it's a different story, but pretty much everyone works with someone at some point. Other piece of advice, get an editor. You do need an editor. Even if you think your thing is great, you will realize how it is not great the moment an editor looks at it and tells you that. There's so many times I've submitted something to my editor and I've been like, this is the best. This is flawless. And then she comes back and she's like, this is very in need of work. And I'm like, well, you're right. So yeah, find other people's opinions to look at your work, start small and try to understand the collaboration process. Oh, and last piece of advice is trust your gut. If someone says, I'm perfect for you, I'll be any art style or whatever, and you look at their stuff and it's not what you want, or they're just don't say yes. Don't be desperate about things. If you think something's good, it's good. If you're not, you know what you're looking for. You know what kind of story you want to tell. So in terms of who you're working with and in terms of how you go about it, I'd say your gut instinct is extremely powerful and you should listen to it. Yeah, just all the time.
Good advice, sir. That's for sure. Well, thanks for that. I'm wondering, do you have a website where you'd recommend people go to find out more about your current and your future projects?
Absolutely. I'm at www.arigross.ca. That's arigross.ca. You can also catch me on Instagram at College Street Comics. That's college_st_comics. I'm also on Twitter at Ari B. Gross, although I don't use Twitter very often. I really recommend going on the website or Instagram. But if you want to message me on Twitter, because that's what you use, I will respond all the same.
Very good. Well, Ari, those are all the questions I have for you. But I'm wondering, is there something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview?
I think the main thing I want to get across in terms of my project now is that it's on from January 17th to February 9th. If you're looking for something fun, if you're looking for something that is literally unlike any other comic you've read in terms of both setting and in terms of the style, the art style, the characters, I mean, give Wardens a look. Like, go to the Kickstarter page, check it out. You'll know if it's for you. There's lots of stuff there to tell you right away that, you know, who the characters are and some sample pages and everything. Yes, I mean, just shameless promotion on my part. And also keep making comics. I mean, comics are amazing. They're my favorite medium. The reason I went into comics as opposed to anything else is just because I think they're the best way to tell the stories I want to tell. And if you think it's the best way to tell the story you want to tell, then you should do it.
Thanks to Ari for the chat. You can check out the Wardens comic book project on Kickstarter. And you can discover more about Ari Gross online at arigross.ca and on Instagram at college_st_comics. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts. And please check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to that video channel and hit the notification button. You can follow along at True North Country Comics on most social media sites. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics podcast is copyright True North Country Comics. Copyright 2024.